Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is another lecture in the history of lesbian and gay life in the United States in the 1950s for the course History 156 American Sexualities. And this is, I'm going to have to stop sort of in the middle of the history because today is the last day of classes, and I can't really give you much work to do after today because we're going into finals week and I want you to be able to understand and study this stuff that we've already looked at. But in a way, this lecture is going to stop at a good place because I'm going to try and take the history of the gay movement up to 1969, which is the year of the Stonewall riots, after which the movement changed a lot, and whether it was a completely new start or whether it was carrying on some of the things that had happened in the 1950s and the 1960s is still a subject of debate. But I will give you some of the things that happened between 1945, the end of World War II, and 1969, the year of the Stonewall riots. One of the, and I didn't give you the opening sign here, but that's what the topic is. And one of the things that actually, I said before in my history of World War II, that World War II was really a game changer for the lesbian and gay community. And another thing that happened, which was had maybe a longer term effect, although it was very striking when it first happened, was the publication of two studies by a scientist named Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a well-respected biologist who already had a successful career, and he did, in cooperation with various assistants, he went all over the United States interviewing lots and lots of people about their sex lives. The method that he went about doing it has come under some criticism. The statistics are not, the number of people he interviewed is not huge in terms of some modern studies. And also the way in which the information was gathered was considered to be kind of questionable. I mean, they were personal interviews, face-to-face interviews that Kinsey and his assistants did. And the idea was, people are not going to really talk about their sex lives to a total stranger. But I think by the end of the 1940s, that was much more likely to be the case because the 20s had really liberalized people's ability to talk about sex. One of the things that had happened was that in World War I and World War II, everybody had been getting these lectures about venereal disease, which, aside from how effective they were in stopping venereal disease, but they enabled people to talk about sexual issues with much greater freedom. And World War II had really opened the eyes of a lot of people as to the kinds of things that were going on out there in the world. So whether or not Kinsey's research was valid by modern statistical standards, one thing that it unquestionably did was to open people's eyes up to the fact that sexual life was much more diverse than anybody had realized. The two books, the first book that was published was about the human male. And by the way, these books were published by academic scientific publishing houses. Actually, Kinsey had gotten an offer from a mainstream press because it was becoming quite clear that this was going to be very controversial. And it did become both of these books became bestsellers when they were published. But Kinsey wanted to present this information within an academic scientific context, so he went with the academic scientific publisher. The book in 1948 was controversial, not only because it gave people a much higher statistic for the incidence of homosexual behavior among men, but there were also other incidents, how often gay and straight men, for instance, masturbated or had extramarital affairs or something like that. The information was really, it flew in the face of a lot of the things that people had believed about male sexuality. And when the book on the female came out, in 1953, then the poop really hit the fan, because one of the things that people found extremely shocking about the book on female sexuality was the indication of the number of women who had had premarital sex or extramarital sex. In other words, they had been having sex with lots of other people besides the people that they had already become married to. And when you think about some of the things that we've been talking about in this course, the idea that women were still, I think, in some circles, believed to be without real sexual aggression. I mean, they had sexuality, but some guy had to come along and bring it out of them. The idea that women were going out on their own and looking for sexual satisfaction outside of the permission of mainstream society was very disturbing to a lot of people. I think at the time, if you had asked, after the publication of the second volume, if you had asked what the main impact of the Kinsey studies was, they would have said, well, it turns out that women are a lot more erotic than we had thought they were. But the information that was being presented about men in the first volume was also controversial. And in terms of the context of this course, one of the things that was really alarming to a lot of people who were not lesbian and gay was the incidence of gay and lesbian activity. And as usual, the press kind of grabbed this and turned it into a simplified and not particularly truthful short version. The short version was that 10% of the population was lesbian and gay. Well, actually, the issue is much more complex, as Kinsey presented it. Kinsey actually had a scale from 0 to 7, 0 being no sexual feelings at all of any kind. And then from 1 to 7, one end was totally heterosexual feelings and experiences. The other end was totally homosexual feelings and experiences. And then you could exist on any point on that continuum. 4, which was between 1 and 7, was absolutely no difference. I mean, the number of heterosexual feelings and the number of homosexual feelings you had were absolutely equal, and in terms of the experience and things like that. So what the press was doing, not particularly convincingly, was that they were saying that everybody on the side of 4 who had confessed to gay experiences, this would be both men and women, would be classified in this 10% category. And of course, this would include people who would, when they were interviewing, and Kinsey was interviewing them, they would say, well, there was that crush I had in college and things like that, which today we would probably not consider to be an identification of somebody as gay or lesbian. And, I myself had sex with women in college, and I identify myself as gay, not as bisexual. But whether the statistics were correct or not, and I fell for the 10% thing myself when I was an undergraduate in college. After having read the Kinsey report, I would sit in a room and count the number of people and say, well, there's 20 people here, so one of the gay people must be me, and in order for it to come up to 10%, there must be one other gay person here in the room. That's not the way it works, obviously. But the way it was released to the public certainly alerted everybody, including gays and lesbians, that there were a lot more of us around than we thought. I mean, it didn't mean that these people were identifying themselves as gays and lesbians. It meant that they had done things or had feelings that would cause you perhaps to look at some people and say, well, I thought they hadn't any clue about gay or lesbian feelings or gay and lesbian relationships. Maybe some of them have more of a clue than I thought. And this began to, as I said, at the end of World War II, you begin to see the formation of these gay and lesbian communities. And at the beginning, of course, the attitude was, oh, it's just a few people that I met when I was in war, serving in the war. But after Kinsey's reports came out, even though you didn't really know how to find more people, you knew there were more people than just the people that you'd met when you were in World War II. One of the things, though, that complicated the ability of gays and lesbians to act on this information was that after we came out of World War II, we went into another kind of war, the Cold War. Um, the Cold War was a response to what we perceived to be the threat of Soviet domination of the world. The Soviets were certainly expansionist in the 1940s and the 1950s. They were moving into Eastern Europe and establishing communist governments in places like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, not necessarily with the consent of the people who lived in those countries. And the idea was that communism was trying to take over the world, and we had to do our very best to hang on to the freedoms we had won through, such effort in World War II. This, however, went along with the problem that nobody in America really understood very much about communism. In fact, the USSR was not a communist country; it was a socialist country. It was the United Socialist Soviet Republics. But if you'd ask somebody to define either communism or socialism, a few years ago I was talking about communism in a history class, and I asked the students, "Well, what is communism?" And one person put her hand up and said, "Something bad." And I don't know that people in the United States in the 1950s necessarily had a much more significant understanding of communism than these were people who were out to destroy our American way of life. Things were so much better in the 1950s than they had been in the 1930s, that people had and a lot of these people had lived through the Depression, and they had a feeling that the happiness that we had been able to establish in the United States after the war was something that could be taken away from us. It was something that we had to guard, and the homosexuals and the communists were out to take that away from us. Now, you may ask, what do homosexuals and communists have to do with each other? In a sense, they really don't have anything to do with each other. They were just scare tactics that people who wanted to gain political power were using. They would tell the American people, if you don't vote for me, then the homosexuals and the communists will take over. But there were a couple of things that the two groups had in common, at least in the popular imagination. One was that they weren't visible. I mean, if you were a woman and you were being discriminated against because you're a woman, everybody would know you're a woman. Unless you had really effective drag, you would be walking down the street and everybody would say, okay, you're a woman. Communists could not be identified in that way. In fact, most communists belong to the functioning communists who were members of the Communist Party of the United States were being very secretive for good reason. And similarly, you couldn't really identify a lesbian or a gay man walking down the street unless the lesbian was really butch or the man was really effeminate. So it left the door open for Americans to look at these two groups and say, to begin with, these are threatening our way of life, because everybody knows that capitalism and the free market economy is what has made America great, and communism is trying to destroy that. And everybody knows that homosexuals are bad. There were theoretical justifications for anti-homosexual purges and witch hunts, such as that, if some Soviet comes along to a homosexual who's working in the government and says, if you don't give me all your secrets, I'll reveal you to the government. And therefore, we shouldn't have gay people in the government. Well, if you know enough about the person to discover he's gay and that he should be kicked out of the government, he can't really be blackmailed, because that's already become public knowledge that he's gay. So if a person is known to be gay, that would be, there's no possibility of blackmail, because the Soviet agent couldn't really tell the government anything that the government doesn't already know. So really, all of the justifications for picking on gay people in the 1950s were based on ignorant and irrational prejudice. Men were continuing to defend their manhood by saying, I may not be out there plowing the field, but at least I'm no sissy who has sex with other men, like that guy over there. And also, after World War II, even though women had taken a lot of roles in the war that were not traditionally feminine and had done quite well in executing the obligations of those roles, the idea was that after the war, things had been disrupted and everybody was, we won the war, but what is it going to be worth if we can't go back to the wonderful old-fashioned American ideal? So in the 1950s, there was this very strong push that women who had had unconventional jobs and who had fulfilled them quite well during the war should now go back to being householders, people who were cooking and cleaning and raising the children. And if you didn't want to do that, then you were sort of subverting the wonderful things that we had all accomplished by winning the war. I'll start a new part here.